Welcome to part 2 of my series on Miles Mathis's paper titled The Hidden Kings. I'm just going to jump right back where we left off from the previous video. I will tell you a bit more about Oswald before we move on. One of Oswald's government handlers is known. His name is George de Manschild, of Russian heritage. His father had been a major general in the Tsar's army before Lenin took over. He was raised in Poland, but immigrated to the US in 1938. Although we are told by mainstream sources that he was thought to have been a German spy, his brother Dmitry is admitted to have been OSS and a founder of CIA's Radio Free Europe. They never bothered to explain why one brother was suspected of being a German spy while the other was hired immediately by the CIA. At any rate, the CIA soon got George involved with the oil business as a cover. As an oil man, he traveled widely, including trips to Costa Rica, Cuba, and Yugoslavia, where he was accused of being a U.S. spy. He lived in Venezuela for a time, working for Pantepic Oil, which was owned by the family of William F. Buckley. Of course, Buckley is now known to have been CIA himself. De Manschild was also a personal friend of Clint Murchison, H.L. Hunt, George Bush Sr., and Ted Dealey. But there's more. In March 1963, de Manschild received a Haitian government contract for $285,000 to set up an industrial enterprise with other investors, which included surveying oil and geological resources on the island. In May, he met in Washington, D.C. with CIA and Army intelligence contacts to further his Haitian connections. All of this is admitted at Wikipedia, which is astonishing. They try to whitewash the information, but do it very poorly. To whitewash the information, they first have to give it to you, and once you have it, there is no way to really cleanse it. It is obvious de Manschild was CIA. As such, he was assigned the job of handling Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But back to Ted Dealey. Does that name ring a bell? Dealey Plaza in Dallas was named after Ted's father. Both were publishers of the Dallas Morning News. So it was no accident the alleged assassination took place on Dealey Plaza. This was part of the plan and the script. We have already seen that de Manschild was very connected, to say the least. He was not just a private person helping out Oswald because Marina Oswald happened to be Russian. Since all this is known about de Manschild, including extensive testimony he gave to the Warren Commission, it has to be spun. It is spun to this day, even by alternative theorists. They commonly point to de Manschild as further evidence of conspiracy. Most often, they use his existence to imply that the CIA got Kennedy. But that is just another pushed reading of the facts. It is far easier and simpler to conclude that de Manschild and the CIA were controlled by Kennedy. Why? Because de Manschild was also a close personal friend of the Kennedys and Bouvieres. Again, we can get that straight from Wikipedia, which admits that. Jacqueline grew up calling de Manschild Uncle George and would sit on his knee. He became a close friend of Jacqueline's aunt Edith Bouvier Beale. How do you spin that? Well, people are still trying, including cutting-edge conspiracy theorist Liam Schkeff, who gives us much of the same information but then refuses to see what it means. He diverts us by telling us that Eisenhower warned of the CIA in 1960, when Kennedy was coming into office. He tells us Eisenhower was warning of the oligarchs who had taken over the country.
Or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
But what Schiff forgets to remind you is that John Kennedy's dad, Joseph, was one of those oligarchs. In the 1950s, he was one of the richest and most powerful men in the country, which the election of his son to the presidency should tell us, if nothing else. And who else was one of these oligarchs? Jacob Schiff. Schiff. Why does Liam Schiff have no bio up on the internet? As with Peter Schiff, his history seems to have been scrubbed. Here is a link to my new paper on Ruby, where we find that he was a Rubinstein, whose father was from Russia. This doesn't mean the Russians were involved, it means Ruby was an agent himself. Among the interesting things we discovered there, the Russian banker Dmitry Rubinstein, personal banker of the Romanovs, as well as the handler of Rasputin. Rubinstein paid Rasputin's rent. Also interesting is that Ruby's attorney was a Stanley Kaufman. The Kaufmans were also tight with the Romanovs, marrying at least two princes in the early 20th century, Prince Romanov-Ayatsky and Prince Dmitry Romanov. The Kaufmans were marrying into the upper reaches of the British peerage at the same time, linking them to the Somerset Dukes, among others. They were also marrying the Habsburgs in Germany and Italy. They were also marrying the Monschilds. That may provide a link between Ruby and Monschild, which would also link Ruby to Kennedy himself. Also of interest is that Ruby currently has a clean record regarding the Oswald murder. He is legally innocent. Yeah, you read that right. Since he allegedly died while his case was under appeal, his record was wiped. Now let us return to Kennedy. Many alternate theorists have proposed that the Bethesda corpse is not Kennedy, and they have explained this switch by saying that the murderers needed to be able to match the wounds to films or theories. But the wounds of the corpse do not match the Zapruder film. And besides, it would make more sense and be much easier to match the film to the wounds than the wounds to the film. Most alternate theorists think that the Zapruder was tampered with, so why not tamper with it to make it match? Why tamper with both the corpse and the film only to have them contradict each other? Both the film and the corpse were faked, so don't imagine I am denying it. But they weren't faked to make the wounds match. The other reason for switching the corpse is to match the Warren Commission theory of a single gunman and a magic bullet. But the Warren Commission is a fantasy from beginning to end, as the alternate theorists tell us. If the Commission could manufacture and sell such a lie, they could have manufactured and sold a similar lie that incorporated Oswald, magic bullets, and the Kennedy's real corpse. In other words, they were obviously not limited to any facts, since they ignored facts whenever they wanted to. They had no need to switch corpses. All they needed to do was sell a slightly different lie. The wounds don't match Zapruder or the theory as it is. In that case, why not have the real corpse instead of a phony? The phony corpse does not solve any problem. In fact, as part of either the standard theory or the alternate theory, the phony corpse has no logical place. A stand-in corpse doesn't sell any part of the Warren Commission's finding, and it doesn't make sense in a cover-up either. In a cover-up, you switch the perpetrators, not the corpse. In a cover-up, switching the corpse would cause more problems, not fewer. And that is what we see. No, the only reason you would need a body double corpse is if you don't have a real corpse. Those who argue that the corpse is not Kennedy never ask the correct question. The correct question is not, where is Kennedy's corpse? If the Zapruder film is fake and the corpse is fake, then we have no evidence that Kennedy was killed at all. All we have is a bunch of eyewitness testimony that a guy in a car who looked like Kennedy appeared to be wounded, and a bunch of eyewitness testimony of shots fired. That is not proof of anything. We have already seen that Oswald faked being hit a second too early, with no blood. But because it was done on camera, with the world watching, we think we have a billion witnesses. Yes, we have a billion witnesses to a guy falling down after a shot is heard. We have witnessed absolutely nothing. It may have been the murder of a president, the murder of a body double, or a complete act. Without the president's body, the correct question is, where is the president? Where is he hiding? That is the correct question. That has been the correct question for decades, and no one has ever asked it. Mr. Morningstar does not ask it either. He presents us with a very detailed theory that provides us with a stand-in corpse, but he uses that only as further proof of a conspiracy. He does not follow his own lead in any logical way. Yes, a stand-in corpse does not stand as further proof of a conspiracy, but that conspiracy must include Kennedy himself, since he is not accounted for. Because Morningstar stops so abruptly, one tends to assume that he thinks that because Tippit must be buried in Kennedy's tomb, Kennedy must be buried in Tippett's tomb. What would the point of that be? Or maybe he wants us to assume that the enemies of Kennedy were so vicious they fed his remains to their dogs or ate him themselves as a final revenge. That is what is strange about almost all the alternate theories. They are ludicrously pro-Kennedy. I can understand being anti-Castro or anti-mob or anti-Johnson or anti-CIA, but that does not mean you have to think Kennedy was a saint, battling these combined forces of evil. I am about as far from the Republican or big money agenda as you can get, but I know something about Kennedy too. I know something about American politics, and I know you don't get to be president by being a white knight of any kind. Morningstar, by his own admission, worked for the Kennedy campaign in 1960, and all his theories are slanted toward Kennedy to this day. Other alternate theorists are even more one-sided, and if we were to believe them, Kennedy was turning America into a paradise, only to be thwarted by closet Nazis in his own cabinet, Nazis he had appointed himself. Even Lyndon LaRouche pushes this view of Kennedy, which is highly strange. Johnson, we are told, wanted nothing more than to escalate in Vietnam, simply to get richer, and yet Jack had no inkling of this? In other words, Johnson, though Democrat, was a fascist swine, while Kennedy was a purblind idealist, ignorant of the most obvious facts around him. I have to admit that I don't like this sort of silly and transparent propaganda any more than I like the sort of propaganda I get from mainstream sources. As further support of this, I send you to the full speech of Kennedy on the shadow government, the one I mentioned earlier.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, There is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people, for I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors, for as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. It means greater attention to improved understanding of the news, as well as improved transmission. And it means, finally, that government at all levels must meet its obligation to provide you with the fullest possible information outside the narrowest limits of national security. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be.
The web is now stiff with excerpts from this speech, and the excerpts are used for two main reasons. Number one, to show that Kennedy was fighting against this shadow government in the way that Teddy Roosevelt is said to have done. Number two, to show us that this shadow government has now taken over after the false flag of 9/11. But the full speech does neither one. All you have to do is listen to the full speech to realize that the excerpts are taken out of context, and that the gist of the speech is the exact opposite of what we're being told. JFK is in fact speaking in favor of governmental secrecy. There is no doubt of this, no room for debate. He says it outright in plain language. He is speaking before the press, asking them to censor themselves out of patriotism. He says that war has not been declared, so certain legal provisions are not in strict effect. But he asks the press and the American people to act as if they are in a declared war, and to therefore put up the heightened levels of governmental and official secrecy. Not only is JFK's speech not a contradiction of Bush's speeches after 9/11, it is a clear precursor. JFK has a better speaking voice, but he is saying the same thing. He is using the Cold War as an excuse for secrecy and unaccountability. The real meaning of the full speech kills number one, since Kennedy was already a member of the shadow government, asking for more shade. But notice that it also kills number two. The shadow government did not take over after 9/11. The shadow government always existed. That this speech should now be used by liberals to counter the neocons' agenda is amazing. We must assume that those who use it this way, including 9/11 truthers and JFK alternate theorists, are either very ignorant or very dishonest, or both. I think it is possible, even probable, that disinformation is being purposefully broadcast by all sides, and it is also possible, even probable, that those who hatched the Kennedy plot are in control of both sides and both theories, both for and against, both the standard model and the alternate model. But let us return to Dallas to deal with Zapruder and the other films, as well as other things going on that day. As others have pointed out, the Zapruder film was fishy from the get-go. Due to the missing frames, it contains lots of other anomalies, discovered by hundreds of researchers. Some of these anomalies I would confirm here if I cared to, but I don't. I don't because in the end all these anomalies act as more misdirection. They get us focusing on details when we should be looking at the overall picture. The biggest problem with the Zapruder film and other film analysis has so far been focus. And I don't mean the focus of the film, I mean the focus of the analysis. We have to separate the more important facts from the less important facts. There are a lot of facts available in Dallas, but only a few of them will be crucial to any final argument. We don't need piles and piles of inconclusive findings, we need just a few conclusive findings. That would be enough. To start with, facts that rely on testimony are never really facts. The other side can always dismiss testimony, calling it a lie or a misremembrance. So we need facts that do not rely on anyone's testimony. If they will not accept our witnesses, we certainly don't have to accept theirs. By the same token, if we think their witnesses are lying, there is no reason for them to take ours on faith. And then there is the very real possibility that no one is telling the truth except those who know nothing. So we must begin with a clean slate. All witnesses on both sides should be thrown out as unreliable. Once we do that, we are down to an analysis of the films and photos, and of other existing physical evidence. The guns and bullets may or may not have been planted, so we must treat them like the witnesses, untrustworthy. That leaves us the films and photos. These can also be faked, so we need evidence that transcends any possible fakery. Could it be possible to accept, without argument, that all the films are genuine and complete and still have perfect evidence of a plot to mislead? It is possible. In fact, it is very easy. The world needs reminding that the burden of proof is on the side of the government here. They are the ones that are trying to sell a story. That story is that JFK was assassinated in Dallas. That story should be very easy to prove beyond any doubt. All we need is a body. Well, I have shown that we don't have a body. They didn't want to give us that. They gave us lots of really poor photos of other people with wounds and stories that changed in spectacular fashion between Dallas and Bethesda. Without that evidence, we must look to the films and photos from Dallas. We don't have to show they are fake or tampered with to show that they prove nothing. We can accept them as they are, as genuine and complete, and still show that they prove nothing. We do this by showing that they are not continuous. We will admit that some of the films and photos from earlier in the route seem to give us a positive ID on the Kennedys. We will also assume that they were actually taken that day, although even this is not certain. But we have no film or photo from which is possible to ID the occupants of the car once it reaches Dealey Plaza. Zapruder and all other films and photos from Dealey Plaza are not of a quality to determine if we are looking at the Kennedys or doubles. We can see lots of people taking pictures in Dealey Plaza, but they always manage to shoot from far away or behind, and Zapruder is the least clear of all. From Zapruder, it is hardly possible to identify the car in exact details, much less the occupants. This is true even before we reach the plaza. Altgen's photo of Houston just before turning into the plaza is from behind, and Scott Hale's photo from Main Street, although from the side, is inconclusive. If anything, Hale's photo is evidence of a body double, since this profile looks nothing like Kennedy. When did Kennedy get a jaw that jutted out like that? Also notice the date at the top of that photo. March 64. They are testing you. It is both highly unusual and highly suggestive that we have no non-stop coverage of the entire tour of Dallas. A presidential motorcade through a major city in the open air on a sunny day, a very rare event for any number of reasons, not the least of which was that it would be certain suicide for Kennedy or any other president before or after. And yet we have no moving coverage by the big three channels? We have to rely on shaky cameramen like Bell and Zapruder and so on, who can't even center the picture? Why? Why is that? And why does no one else ask that question? Why do the alternate theorists always ask questions that lead off into a mire or a bog, but never ask questions that lead somewhere? Why do we have 44 years of people getting bogged down in technical details, eyewitness testimony, and other dead ends, while the crucial questions are never asked? The question of tampering or faking of films is interesting, but it is not crucial. The central fact of all the films is that, taken as a whole, they don't provide continuity. The entire motorcade could have stopped just before Dealey Plaza for cold drinks and a bathroom break, and we would have no knowledge of that. You will say there would have been testimony to such a thing, but you should say there might have been testimony to such a thing. If anyone had thought it was important enough to mention, and if that anyone had not been suppressed, then yes, we would know of it by testimony. Otherwise, we would not know of it. There are many things we do not know of from that day, and adding one more thing to that list is hardly revolutionary. Suppose that, just before Dealey Plaza, the Kennedys did run into a department store really fast, surrounded by the Secret Service, and then ran out again only a minute later. The crowd would see it as a bathroom break and think nothing of it. After a murder, who thinks to mention something like that? How could it be pertinent? If anyone does mention it, it is shrugged off as inconsequential. You will say, we have no evidence that it did happen. And I respond, we have no evidence that it did not happen. Because of the strange video evidence that has come down to us, the possibility is wide open. That is all I need. I don't need to prove anything. All I need to show is that we have no reliable evidence that the Kennedys are in the car in Dealey Plaza. Section added March 2015. A reader just pointed out to me that there is congressional testimony with Connolly where he admits they stopped 2 or 3 times. Here is the testimony. Mr. Spector, did the automobile stop at any point during this procession? Governor Connolly, yes it did. There were at least 2 occasions on which the automobile stopped in Dallas and perhaps a third. There was one little girl, I believe it was, who was carrying a sign saying, "Mr. President, will you please stop and shake hands with me?" or something. That was the import of the sign. And he just told the driver to stop, and he did stop and shook hands. And, of course, he was immediately mobbed by a bunch of youngsters, and the Secret Service men from the car following us had to immediately come up and wedge themselves in between the crowd and the car to keep them back away from the automobile, and it was a very short stop. At another point along the route, a sister, a Catholic nun, was there, obviously from a Catholic school with a bunch of little children, and he stopped and spoke to her and to the children. And I think there was one other stop on the way downtown, but I don't recall the precise occasion. But I know there were 2, but I think there was still another one. Knowing what we know now, you have to admit that is curious testimony. All 3 stops are curious. The first 2 read like a Hollywood script, inserted specifically for emotional effect. Children and nuns? I am just surprised we didn't have to hear about a 3-legged dog and a veteran in a wheelchair and a mom with an apple pie. But the third is the strangest. Connolly can remember these children and nuns, but he can't remember the third stop? Any psychologist would tell you this reads like someone covering something. It's textbook. It has all the signs of poor lying. Someone telling a fib and not doing it well at all. He thinks they stopped a third time, but can't tell us what it was. Why even mention it then? Why not just say 2 times, or make up some stupid story about the third time? Because he is a bad liar. And his conscience is inserting itself right here. It's a huge Freudian red flag. I suggest this third time Connolly is thinking of is the time they stopped to bring in the body double, just as I said. It is impossible to know, of course, but it proves my point. I said this could have happened, and as far as the stopping goes, it did happen. According to this curious testimony, they stopped at least 3 times. 3 times when, if this thing had not been completely controlled, they should not have stopped at all. The government is claiming something, not me. The government has some minimum burden of proof, not me. You and I are like the jurors, not the lawyers. We should be presented with real evidence, not expected to present it. Our primary job is to falsify claims, not make them. The government claims that Kennedy was killed, and it offers us as evidence the Bethesda photos and the films from Dallas. I only need to show that the government's evidence proves nothing. I am not called upon to prove an alternate theory. On the contrary, the government is called upon to show the proof that the president was killed. It has not done that. Because the lack of continuity in the films and the lack of positive ID in Dealey Plaza, we have proof of nothing. The evidence only appears to point to a murder of Kennedy. But logically, it absolutely fails to do so. If you watch all the films that day, you are left with the impression that we have a complete record of the motorcade through Dallas. You think you are able to positively identify the Kennedys at the beginning. You assume the continuity, and you assume the Kennedys are in the Zapruder film. But, as I have shown you, we have no evidence that the Kennedys are in the car in the Zapruder film. Lacking continuity, we only have what we can see. And what we can see is people who look like the Kennedys from a distance. We know that the Kennedys traveled with lookalikes, so this is proof of absolutely nothing. Given the evidence we have, it is possible, and I would say almost a surety, that Jack Kennedy is not in that car in Dealey Plaza. Given this, it simply doesn't matter if the films or photos were tampered with or faked. Even in complete and perfect form, they don't prove or even indicate anything. The only thing they indicate is that someone that looks like Kennedy got hit in the head with something. Given the quality of the films and photos, it could have been a bullet or a tomato. We have no way of knowing. I think the Zapruder film was tampered with, but even if we accept the final cut as genuine, the fatal hit still looks more like a man getting hit by a tomato from the front than it does a man getting shot from either the front or the back. As a matter of ballistics, the fatal hit doesn't look like a bullet hitting anything. Any honest firearms expert would tell you that. Entry wounds don't look like that at all, and exit wounds don't have a spray pattern like that. A real exit wound from a rifle would have sprayed forward onto the Connellys in a visible forward cone, not a circular little poof. All the expert testimony you have seen on TV or read is planted disinformation, but it doesn't really matter. All the specific and minute questions of facts are beside the point once you realize we have no strong or even leading evidence that anyone was killed that day. We don't have to prove it was or was not Kennedy, or that it was or was not a bullet, or that it was one shooter or 20 shooters. All these things are beyond proof or disproof, given the evidence we have. The bottom line is that we have no evidence that would hold up in court that Kennedy or anyone else was killed that day. In fact, that is precisely why Oswald had to appear to be killed. The government couldn't risk taking him to trial and giving him an attorney. They not only had no evidence against him, they had no evidence that the president was dead. Any good attorney would have found the gigantic holes that I have just found, and any honest jury would have had to dismiss for lack of a body. Given that, the correct question is not, where is Kennedy's body, or who killed Kennedy and why? The correct question is, why did Kennedy fake his own death? The lack of a body, the cover-up, the tampering with evidence, the incredible amount of inconsistency, the lies told on all sides by everyone, the misdirection and misinformation, the continued misdirection and misinformation after 44 years, all point to a death that was quite simply faked. Neither the standard theory nor the alternate theory fit the facts or the evidence. Both accept the assassination without any proof, or requiring any proof. Why? What kind of investigators accept a murder with no body? What kind of alternate investigators are brave and honest enough to propose that fake corpses were used, but never see that this means there was no real corpse? Why do alternate theorists rush to the initial conclusion that Kennedy was assassinated, just as fast as the single bullet people? You will say they do so because Kennedy was no longer president, was no longer visible, was no longer living at his old address, and was no longer found at Martha's Vineyard. But that is proof of nothing. I could say that is proof that the US government chose to go underground on that day, November 22nd, 1963, and that this is the way they chose to do it. Kennedy wanted more secrecy, and what better way to achieve that than to take the entire presidency underground? This is not to say that Kennedy had to live in Iron Mountain and never saw the light of day again. It is just to say that he had to quit making public appearances and had to hide his movements and so on. Other people have done that for decades, people without the resources of the White House and the federal government. Naysayers will argue that this is impossible. Naysayers make the same argument about 9/11, and it holds the same amount of water here as it does there. None. They say that things can't be kept secret, that people can't disappear, and so on. Complete balderdash. Of course, since we have any number of examples of both. Lots of things are kept secret for decades, and people that aren't dead disappear all the time. The official report of the assassination is proof of this itself. Even if you believe the Warren Commission, you must be aware that certain secrets still exist. The final documents of the Warren Commission are not to be released until 2017, assuming that critical documents were not destroyed long ago. The House assassination documents in the National Archive, some 848 boxes of sealed documents, are not to be released until 2039. This is common knowledge. Those are secrets being successfully kept, are they not? Another example is the Manhattan Project, kept secret for years. Another secret is Lookout Mountain in Laurel Canyon, kept secret for decades. Another example is the current gag order on Sybil Edmonds. That is a secret being kept today, is it not? The government has many official means of keeping secrets, from gag orders and sealed documents to redacted passages to various levels of classification. To assume that secrets cannot be kept is simply naive. And the government may be assumed to have other methods of keeping secrets, ones that are not official. Do you know what is going on in Iron Mountain, in the Pentagon, in Los Alamos, in Guantanamo, in Langley, Virginia, in Laredo, Mexico, on every small island dotting the coast of North America? No. Taking the presidency underground would be a small concern compared to other things the government does every day. You fake a death, put another guy in the White House as a frontman, Johnson, and then call in your orders on the phone. You could even hijack at Martha's Vineyard, with no inconvenience to him or the family. Do you know what goes on at the Kennedy estates? Did anyone ever know anything that went on there? Unless those who were there wanted them to know. No. Why exactly would it be difficult to take a presidency underground? You don't know what is going on in my house, or the house next door to you. What makes you think you know, or could know, or would know anything about the Kennedys unless they wanted you to know? The press wasn't even bright enough to show up to film the motorcade in Dallas. That is why we have to rely on the shaky hands of Zapruder and high-shot Bell. The press wasn't bright enough to ask for evidence the president was dead. The press wasn't bright enough to see through the Oswald Act. What makes you think the press is bright enough or self-motivated enough to penetrate the Kennedys' secrets? There has never been any sort of investigation of that sort, even at the Kennedy compound. Jack could still be there, watching TV and eating Doritos, and no one would know the difference. You don't find things you don't look for, and no one has ever investigated the possibility that Jack continued to be president after November 22, 1963. Before we move on, I want to point out that this explains all the coincidences between the Lincoln assassination and the Kennedy assassination. These coincidences include name and date coincidences and have been publicized for many decades. You have probably heard of them. One of them concerns Lincoln's Secretary Kennedy and Kennedy's Secretary Lincoln, for instance. Well, since I have shown that both assassinations were manufactured, we now see that the coincidences weren't coincidences at all. They were parallels, purposefully inserted in both stories after the fact by storytellers. You can also think of them as clues. They were clues planted by intelligence to test your intelligence. The storytellers want to fool you, yes, but they want to toy with you at the same time, since it makes them feel twice as powerful. We will see many more examples of that below. But let us return to Dallas for more clues. According to the mainstream stories, security was terrible that day. Downtown Dallas was uncontrolled. According to the alternative theories, security was even worse, allowing multiple shooters and immediate free access to the street. I will show you that this appearance that Dallas was uncontrolled is false. Remember that the alternate theorists look at the open windows in the book depository and assume that means the Secret Service was not in control of the building. But then they assume later that the Secret Service was part of the conspiracy, or that a gun was planted in the depository, or that Oswald was a patsy, and/or was framed, and so on. In other words, they imply that the open windows were not an accident or oversight. The building was not uncontrolled, it was controlled by the bad guys, whoever they were, and they were part of the government. Although I agree that the building was controlled, I make a different assumption about who was controlling it. I assume that since Kennedy was in control of the overall event, his men must have been in full control of that entire part of the city. That means that they were in full control of the crowd and all the buildings. If windows were left open, they were not left open to encourage snipers. They were left open to be conspicuous pieces in a play. To say it another way, the whole motorcade was like a Hollywood movie. Yes, they were shooting a movie that day. In fact, they were shooting several. They hired multiple amateur cameramen to film their one-day movie and a host of extras. Everyone there that day, including Zapruder and Bell and all the rest, were extras in the movie. In that sense, they were all conspirators. But remember, they were not conspirators to a murder, which makes it somewhat easier to understand. It made it so much easier for all these people to lie, since there was never any blood on anyone's hands that day. They were not lying about the assassination of a president, no. They were only lying about a president going underground for his own safety. They were protecting their beloved commander-in-chief. We already have extensive proof that many of these people were insiders. Zapruder is the best example. Somehow he managed to bump into the Secret Service within mere moments of the shooting, and the film of his camera was taken by them to be developed. This is known, and yet it is not interpreted. As Sherlock would have said, it is seen but not observed. Zapruder was an extra that day, probably paid extra. Therefore, nothing he did that day was an accident. It was all scripted. If he was too far away for a positive idea, that was no accident. If he had a companion to corroborate his story, that was no accident. If he ran into the Secret Service soon after the shooting, that was not serendipity. That was the plan. Same thing with Bell. Why were these cameramen shooting from 100 yards away in Dealey Plaza when we know people were snapping pictures from the curbside? It is not that Zapruder or Bell got there late. Zapruder tells us that he walked back to stand on the wall. But why would he do that? The crowds were so sparse in Dealey Plaza, he didn't have to shoot over anyone. Zapruder is supposed to be shooting from that white wall back there, but no one is in front of him. Why not shoot from the curbside? And besides, people were stepping out into the street to take pictures, as we know from the pictures themselves. We can see from Zapruder's and Bell's own films that there were no ropes and no police presence to keep picture takers on the grass or at a safe distance. Zapruder had no need to back up 100 yards. We must assume he did it for a reason, and the best assumption to make is that he did it under orders. From the curbside, he might have filmed something important. From the back on the white wall, his film was useless except as propaganda. By the same token, the windows in the book's depository were just part of the script, part of the movie that was being shot. They were open to cue the audience, to make it easy for the viewer to finger the position of the villain. More evidence in support of this is found by looking at the crowd in Dealey Plaza. This crowd has been studied in detail, but the big question has not been asked. That question is, why so few people? You have blue skies and lots of green grass. This is the only open space, the only park-like area along the route? This would be the best place to camp out, waiting for the motorcade. We see no ropes, almost no police. The public appears to be welcome. We are given no indication that the public was kept away, since if they had been, these day-tripping Dallasites we do see would not be there either. No, we are to believe that the public was welcome but only showed up in 2s and 3s? Kennedy was the most popular president since Teddy Roosevelt, and yet Dallas decided to stay home? You might think that few knew of the motorcade, but the Dallas Morning Star had published a map of the route that morning. Both Dallas papers had published the route on the 19th, 3 days earlier, so people had time to make picnic plans and whatnot. You would expect that everyone who worked downtown would be taking a coffee break to run downstairs. Those who did not work downtown and did not need to be able to scoot back up to the office afterwards would naturally be drawn to the grassy open plaza where the biggest crowds could gather. The slopes would allow even latecomers to see over those in front of them, as you can see from the stairs leading up to the grassy knoll. A knoll is a hill, and yet we see only a single broken line of watchers downtown and a nearly empty Dealey Plaza. For clear proof of this, see the Mary Muchmore video, shot from the opposite side of Zapruder. Where is everybody? Why is there just a scattering of people here, where the best grass is and the most open space? This makes no sense if you accept the standard theory, and the alternate theories make no effort to explain it either. According to them, it is just a coincidence or an accident. It is beyond explanation. But in the real story, it is easily explained. This area was not open to the public. It only appeared to be open to the public. Actually, everyone there had been staged and scripted. They were told what to say afterwards or told to say nothing. And that is why you see so few people. The assistant directors of the movie had every reason to limit the number of extras hired, since every extra was a potential risk. They might blab later. This is the obvious explanation for why the crowds were only one deep in the first part of the motorcade, and why they are almost non-existent in Dealey Plaza. All the extras further back in the route can be lied to. They can be treated almost like the ignorant public. Only the extras actually in Dealey Plaza have to be told the larger parts of the story, so the assistant directors would naturally want to limit their numbers as much as possible. You have just enough extras there to act as fake witnesses and cameramen, but no more. That is the explanation for the sparseness of the crowd in the best part of the route. You can see that it makes much more sense to assume that Kennedy was in complete control of Dallas that day, than to assume that he was absurdly out of control of everything. What we saw was a motorcade that didn't make sense. It seemed to be absurdly out of control. Both the standard story and the alternate story make no sense of it. They push the story in the direction of even greater amounts of chaos. The standard story wants us to believe that Kennedy would ride through a major city with the crowds and buildings uncontrolled. We have people purposefully allowed to stand on the curb without ropes or police, and we have buildings with open windows and so on. Makes no sense. The alternate theory corrects this theory, not by pushing it towards sensibility or control, but by pushing it into greater levels of chaos. Instead of one shooter in one location, we have multiple shooters in multiple locations. We have people carrying guns into the area of the motorcade from all points on the compass, and not just handguns, but rifles, which are not so easy to conceal. We have the Secret Service being pulled from the car. We have breakdowns in every direction, all unnoticed by Kennedy. In fact, to accept the alternate theories, we have to assume that their hero Kennedy was an absolute idiot. According to the alternate theories, we have a city in such a state of chaos that only a tranquilized mannequin could fail to sense it. But rather than push the scene in that direction, it makes much more sense to push it in the other direction. If we see apparent chaos, it was more sensible to assume that this chaos is faked. For instance, if we see the Secret Service being pulled off the car, we must assume that Kennedy can feel the weight being lost from the rear end. He is near the back of the car. Two grown men climbing off the car is not going to pass unknown to Kennedy. Therefore, we must assume that he knew about it. He didn't look back and order them back on, so we may assume that he is the one who ordered them off. If they make elaborate, gesticulated protests about it to their superior officers, we must assume that these protests are scripted. In fact, they look scripted. In The Men Who Killed Kennedy, we see the agent shrugging 3 times, each time more obvious than the last. We are told by the narrator, yes, and why is that? Do you think the agent was drawing attention to himself? Is that what agents are taught to do? If they're about to murder the president, do you suppose they squabble in public about it with huge gestures? No, it was part of the play, just like the open windows. Kennedy is about to fake his own death, so he has to clear the way for the fake bullet. He knows the bullet is supposed to come from the open windows, and he doesn't want anyone to ask questions later about the line of sight of Oswald. But pulling the agents off the car must seem strange, so Kennedy makes it part of the script. The agent is told to ham it up, as if he is asking the guys in the following car why it is happening. It can't be thought that Kennedy ordered them off, since that would be even more suspicious than the superior officers ordering them off. So the Secret Service plays its little part here and allows itself to look like part of the conspiracy. They knew they could never be prosecuted for a fake death, so what is a little acting? it was all part of the job. They were, in fact, protecting their president, as you now see. But was there a body double in Dealey Plaza or not? I will be asked. I spent a page setting that argument up, but if the whole thing was a stage play, then there doesn't appear to be any need for a body double. Yes, earlier I left open the possibility that a stunt double was used in the second part of the route, and even left open the possibility that the stunt double was killed. But an actual murder in Dealey Plaza is not a necessary part of the plot of this movie. No real shots were fired. That would risk losing a bullet in the grass to be found later. Better to fire blanks and then plant all the bullets and damage later, right where you need it. You have control of the car afterwards, so you can fire any bullets you want into it later. Plus, you have the films. If you don't want to shut down Dealey Plaza again in the future in order to fix any gaps that show up later, you have the films you can retouch. In fact, that was the whole point of the films. You not only have a record to stand as proof to the public, you have a correctable record. The real conspirators are still correcting the Zapruder film, as we can see from the internet to this day. Most copies of the Zapruder film posted on the web have been tampered in some way, either by cutting the beginning or end, by running only in slow-mo, by clipping the edges, or by stabilizing the film, which conveniently purges this anomaly or that. No one was killed. There was a body double in Dealey Plaza. I used the body double argument earlier mainly in order to show there was no proof of a murder. The simple idea of a body double combined with the lack of film continuity meant that we had no evidence that would hold up in court that anyone was murdered that day. But it is clear that Kennedy was not in Dealey Plaza at all, for several reasons. One, Zapruder and Bell and Daniels all shot from far away or panned away at the crucial moment. Mormon shot from behind. If Kennedy was actually there, we would have no reason to keep the films at a distance. 2. Whatever happened to the Kennedy double, whether it was film fakery and heavy acting or a tomato or something else, was probably not pleasant. If we assume that we are seeing more than crude special effects at the critical hit, then even the least nasty thing, the tomato, would still be something Kennedy would want to avoid. Getting hit in the eye with a tomato is not a lot of fun and could cause injury. 3. Once you start having blanks fired and deaths faked, you are in a touchy situation, no matter how in control of the scene you are. All it would take is one traitor substituting a real bullet for a blank, and your fake death becomes a real one. Yes, you would immediately have your man, but some traitors give their lives for a cause. It would be too risky for Kennedy to be in the car during the critical scene in the movie. At some point, late in the route, the switch was made. Although, of course, I can't say precisely how. If all the spectators were extras, it makes it a lot easier to explain, since no one has to be fooled. It is more likely, however, that most of them were fooled somehow. The more of them you fool, the fewer of them you have to pay or threaten or convince. A possibility may be given to us by two famous photos by Altgens. We have the photo from behind taken by Altgens on Houston Street, which I have already mentioned. Then we have a photo taken in front by Altgens on Elm, just after the fatal hit. In passing, I will mention that in neither photo can we identify the passengers, which is convenient. But that is not my point here. My point is that Altgens must have had superhuman speed to outrun the car between Houston and Elm. Some will look to the route and say that he cut across the triangle, but that doesn't hold up to scrutiny since there was a building in the way. While the motorcade was going around the corner, he would have had either to follow it around the corner, running into the crowds, or to run backwards, around the building, across the plaza, beating the car to the point of the second photo. I find it difficult to believe that he could have done that. I find it even more difficult to believe that he would have gone to the trouble to do that, only to get in the second position and take another photo of no one. Why would anyone take a picture of the back of the president's head, then go, "Oh, darn," sprint ahead, making sure to outrun the car, and then take a photo of the front windshield with no one important in the frame? Two other scenarios are much more likely given the evidence. Either both shots were set up for outguns by the assistant directors, making sure that nothing of importance was visible, or the motorcade stopped at some point between the two photos, allowing outguns time to get ahead. The motorcade would have no reason to stop for traffic at the intersection of Houston and Elm, so possibly they stopped to switch the real Kennedy for the fake one. The second outguns photo also stands as proof of one of my other contentions, that being that people were stepping into the street to take photos. The angle of this photo makes it clear that outguns was right in the middle of the street, not too very far in front of the motorcycle cops. This is extraordinary in itself. It suggests that all normal rules of conduct were out the window that day, and it suggests that these amateur cameramen and photographers were not amateurs at all. They were paid to do what they were doing. They were paid to do it poorly, and they were allowed extraordinary access to do it. Let's look closer at this shot of outguns. In these enlargements, we can see that Connolly is looking to his right, but as I said, we cannot identify Kennedy. He is behind the rearview mirror, and is said to be clutching his throat. In the further blow-up, we see several more problems. Yes, we see a large hand up, but we cannot see what it is clutching, or if it is clutching anything. We can see for sure that his arm is being held by a white glove, which we assume is Jacqueline's hand. But it appears to me he is ducking, not clutching his throat. His head is under the hand. Why? Because the top half of a head we see does not belong to the man with the hand up. It is too small. Look first at how big the hand is compared to the head. Then compare that head to the head of the front seat passenger. Then compare that small head to the head of the men in the following car. That head is smaller than the heads in the following car. That is the head of someone kneeling behind the car. Also, it doesn't look like Kennedy anyway. If Kennedy is in the car, he is ducking behind Connolly, not clutching his throat. Well, if he is ducking, he must be in danger, right? Maybe, but not from gunshots. Mike Rivero has asked why the man in the following car, in the middle behind the rearview mirror, is smiling. See the green line. He sees this man as a conspirator, but a better question is why all the people in the crowd are continuing to smile and clap. Notice on the far right, someone is in the middle of a clap, and on the far left, all the people are continuing to smile and look forward. Would they do that if shots had been rung out? If 3 shots had just rung out, the cars would have screeched to a stop, the motorcycle cops would have their feet on the pavement, and the Secret Service would be jumping toward the car. People would be screaming in horror or have their mouths open or would be falling to the ground. Whether staged or not, this is not a picture of shots ringing out. If I knew nothing of history and were studying this photograph as a forensic expert, I would say that the man behind the car had just jumped into the street behind Kennedy. Jacqueline had warned him, and he had ducked his head under his arm as a precaution. Connolly and the 2 Secret Servicemen have turned to monitor the minor threat, as has the policeman to the left. The crowd to the left also seems to be looking in that direction, but since they are smiling, I assume the man behind the car is just clowning, or running into the street to grab a memento or something. People are smiling or responding to a low-grade threat because that is what is happening. I see no sign of either shots or intrigue. Beyond that, I ask again why no one sees Algins as a threat to the motorcade, although he is obviously standing in the middle of the damn street to take this picture. Are the motorcycle cops just going to drive around him and pat him on the back as they pass? An even better question is why are we told this is the point of the 3 shots when it is clearly too early? There are still buildings to the left, we haven't even gotten to the sign, much less to the Zapruder film's sequence point. Just look at the curve of the street. The motorcade is still in the turn. Oswald would have to shoot through that tree from there. Another thing to notice is the shadowed face of the front passenger. Why can't we see his face? We can't see his face in other photos, so it is not to prevent his identification that day. I would suggest it is to prevent our noticing that he is not the same guy as the other pictures of that day. As you will see in a moment, several takes were shot, perhaps even on separate days, and we have many continuity problems. It may be that they didn't even remember to get the right guy in the right role there, and had to shadow him out in the lab later. Finally, notice the people hanging out the window in the second enlargement. Is that evidence of a route that has been properly secured? No! This isn't a real presidential motorcade. This is some sort of Hollywood production, poorly managed for continuity and believability.
Just let me out.